Dr. Darity is the Samuel DuBois Cook Professor of Public Policy, African American Studies, and Economics, and the director of the Samuel DuBois Cook Center for Social Equity at Duke University. He has served as the chair of the Department of African and American Studies and was at Duke, and was the founding director of the Research Network on Racial and Ethnic Inequality at Duke. Previously, he served as director of the Institute of African American Research, director of Moore Undergraduate Program, Undergraduate Research Apprenticeship Program, director of the Undergraduate Honors Program in Economics, and director of the Graduate Studies at the University of North Carolina. In addition to these incredible credentials, he is an extremely caring and compassionate, warm individual. It has been my great pleasure to get to know him and to get to know some of his really phenomenal staff. We look forward to learning and hearing some of his insights into adult education, adult literacy, and how some of these intersections. His research focuses on inequality by race, class, and ethnicity, stratification economics, schooling, and the racial achievement gap. North-South theories of trade and development, skin shade and labor market outcomes, the economics of reparations, the Atlantic slave trade and the Industrial Revolution, the history of economics, and the social psychological effects of exposure to unemployment. So, Dr. Darity, if you would please come to the podium.
So I'd like to start the conversation today by talking about, of all things, the Cuban literacy miracle. There was a mass literacy campaign that was undertaken in Cuba prior to the Cuban Revolution itself, a literacy campaign that was part of the insurgents' agenda. Abel and Abel in 2017 wrote an article in the Texas Journal of Literacy Education where they made the following observation. As the rebel army gained territory, it established local literacy boards and organized schools for children and soldiers in each locality it liberated. And after the revolutionary government was formed, they say, the government provided simple, basic teaching supplies to volunteers and workers to rural locations. 6 years before the onset of the revolution, more than 20% of Cubans 10 years of age or older lacked basic literacy. Literacy was concentrated in urban Cuba, and the exile population was far more well-educated than the population who remained in Cuba. Literacy rates approached a mere 60% in rural Cuba. But less than a year after the revolution had taken place, the country had moved to a 96% literacy rate for the entire population. And by 2003, for young people between the ages of 15 and 24, there was a 100% literacy rate. Now, according to many, many observers, this kind of change in the degree of literacy in a community was unprecedented. But what I want to ask is, was it really unprecedented? And I would like to turn to the United States' own history of race, racism, and literacy. In 1860, on the eve of the Civil War, it's been estimated that 5% of the persons who were enslaved in the United States had or possessed basic literacy skills. It, of course, had been illegal to teach enslaved folk to read, primarily because of the desire on the part of the slaveholders to maintain social control of the forced labor force. In fact, the historian Antonio Bly wrote the following. He said, elite whites worried that slaves who could read and write and would travel more easily throughout the population and be exposed to ideas of freedom, making them more inclined to rebel. The net effect was, as I said, an estimated 5% literacy rate existed among the enslaved population. This means that 1 out of 20 folks who had been enslaved might possess basic reading and writing skills. And more often than not, of course, they had to keep their skills hidden from old Massa and old Missy. Now, on the basis of my estimates, by 1870, 50% of the formerly free blacks were literate, while 10% of the formerly enslaved blacks were literate, which was double the proportion that existed at the time of emancipation. Now, clearly there was an advantage to being a free black, even in the oppressive conditions of that society. However, it was 80% of whites who were literate at the time. Indeed, the overall black literacy rate was approximately 20% in 1870. Now, somewhat remarkably, in the span of 50 years, the rate of literacy among blacks in the United States had risen to 80%. Between 1870 and 1900, the black literacy rate doubled again. These kinds of outcomes were the consequence of the fashioning of family and community literacy strategies. Each one, teach one was an innovation that was associated with the literacy revolution that occurred among black Americans in the United States. And the students range from at least 7 to 70 years of age. This literacy revolution was accomplished against great resistance. Literacy was linked very closely, as it is today, to general educational opportunities. And white resistance to black educational attainment was profound, even in the aftermath of the Civil War. This included the destruction or burning of a number of schools that had been built or established for the purposes of providing education to black students. But even more pronounced was the grossly uneven funding that was associated with the dual system in the South. So one of the most extreme examples is 1912 in Alabama, where the schools provided 32 cents per black student versus $15 per white student. Moreover, there has been a long-standing refusal in the United States to make education or literacy a fundamental right for all citizens. There is no constitutional right written into the original Bill of Rights for education. There's no provision there. Some people interpret the 14th Amendment as a mechanism to ensure public education for all under the conditions of the Equal Protection Clause. It is true that during the period of Reconstruction, black-controlled legislatures throughout the South were the first to introduce universal public schooling. But there is no right to equal educational quality that we can detect in any of the founding documents, and not even in the state constitutions where some provision for education is made. Okay. I didn't think it was that dramatic, but all right. So there's a lot of variation across the states to this day. Some of you may be well familiar with the North Carolina Supreme Court's decision in 1997 associated with the Leandro decision that all children residing in North Carolina have a fundamental state constitutional right to the opportunity to receive a sound and basic education. This particular court decision, in principle, sets a threshold for the minimum standard of education that's supposed to be provided to all in North Carolina, but it does not, once again, establish a premise that there should be equality of educational access and opportunity. Even worse, a recently filed federal district court case in Michigan resulted in a ruling that students at poorly performing schools do not have a constitutional right to a better education. The suit filed in 2016 charged that students in Detroit's most underperforming schools had been denied access to literacy because of underfunding, mismanagement, and discrimination. The judge ruled in this case that access to literacy is not a constitutional right. So we have a long historical climate of resistance to the provision of quality education for all Americans, and more particularly, the assurance or provision of literacy for all Americans. So it's this climate and these structural conditions that make the Durham Literacy Center, which is in some sense carrying the torch of the ex-slave's dream of literacy for all, it makes the Durham Literacy Center so very vital. Now, I want to add at this point that there's a set of personal benefits that are associated with increased literacy. There are greater occupational opportunities, which may lead to higher incomes, and a lower likelihood of being exposed or experiencing poverty. It's also a window to further educational attainment. It also includes the prospects of transmitting improved opportunities for literacy and educational attainment among one's children and among other relatives. Greater levels of literacy are associated with higher levels of health and nutrition. And then I would add that greater literacy liberates your mind to the world of ideas. I think in particular, you can share in the imagination of others that might be expressed both in fiction and in nonfiction. And this is a very enriching and exciting aspect of life. So these are personal benefits, benefits that we might view as accruing to individuals. But I also want to talk about some of the social and collective benefits that are associated with increased literacy. And these social and collective benefits include the following. There is evidence to indicate that improved literacy is associated with higher levels of economic growth, lower levels of deprivation in communities, reduced crime, increased civic engagement. It enhances cultural diversity through literacy programs that include an array of languages, multiple languages. There's some intimation, once again, that at the national or global level, higher levels of literacy are associated with improved health outcomes, and it increases the degree of self-esteem, confidence, and empowerment that members of a particular community or society might experience. There is a proviso, though. According to the Educational Trust, the benefits of literacy ensue only when broader rights and development frameworks are in place and operating effectively. And indeed, they include in this context the availability of written materials that are uncensored and widely accessible. So they're suggesting that there has to be a context in which literacy is going to be most effective in enhancing social outcomes in a community. This suggests to me that the story that I started with, which is the idea both in the Cuban context and the US context that literacy is something that is a political project, ultimately comes into play again. For literacy to have its full benefits, the political project that's associated with creating an appropriate human rights framework must be part and parcel of our objectives. So achieving literacy is an outcome of individual determination, drive, and courage. That's critical. And having the support from an organization like the Durham Literacy Center makes it possible for the persons with determination, drive, and courage to obtain their goal of becoming active readers and active writers. But we also need an active social movement to achieve a comprehensive educational and literacy revolution. We need to make high-quality education a right for all Americans, both in law and in fact.